And welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:14 p.m. in, yes, very cold, snowy, icy, dark city of Budapest, where though it hasn't snowed for 2 days, that doesn't make the place any more attractive because here they don't really clear the snow. So what happens, as you might expect, is that the snow congeals into ice, and therefore the streets become extremely slippery, and therefore make it quite dangerous for people to walk, and not at all attractive for bicycle riders like myself, because this is really quite dangerous. And interestingly, even in the entrances to, say, supermarkets, no one seems to bother to clear the ice, so people walking in are regularly slipping. And but oddly enough, no one really here fears litigation. I mean, this wouldn't happen in the United States because obviously people are shop owners, business owners worry about possibility of litigation if somebody slips and hurts himself. But oddly enough, people just don't worry about possible litigation. Anyway, so a few things to talk about. Um, so in the United States currently, it's a condition of deja vu all over again, because we're back in Minnesota, and so we're reliving the awful days of 2020, and the whole George Floyd killing, and then the subsequent riots. And Meg says, I was going to say that the Hungarians are obviously not litigious enough. No, they really aren't. And I'm always amazed by that how little they seem to be troubled by the menace of lawsuits. So there's a lot of things that are just, you look at them and say, this is dangerous. Somebody is going to get hurt. But apparently there just isn't really that fear that anyone's going to be slapped with a debilitating lawsuit. So like uh, building works on the street are clearly not marked off, with clear lights, um, and signs. So if it's in the dark, anybody could just simply go straight into fall into a hole that's just been dug in the middle of the street, because it's just simply not been marked off properly. And you think, hey, this is asking for an accident, and it is asking for a whopping great payout for damages. But again, nobody seems to worry about that. Um, and so that's that. Anyway, back to Minnesota and the why I said it's deja vu all over again is that some of the same characters are still around, which is quite extraordinary. So we got Tim Walz, who's still the governor for the time being, um, because he's now announced that he will not be running for re-election. Um, Even though he obviously was planning to run, which was bizarre because the Somali scandal had been brewing already for some time, but he thought that he had a shot at re-election. Indeed, he believed, delusional fool that he is, believed that he actually had a shot at running for the Democratic nomination for 2028. But the scale of the fraud, the Somali fraud, was so overwhelming. And since it all happened on his watch, which means that he either took part in the fraud, or more likely, he looked the other way, or he was completely hopeless, incompetent. Either, whichever the option, he had no shot whatsoever of getting reelected. But he's nonetheless still there. I mean, so here he is, and doing his usual uh, poisonous, um, incendiary best to turn what happened yesterday into some national crisis. So as you know, there was um, an ICE operation in Minneapolis. ICE are trying to deport illegals. And as always happens when you have these ICE operations, there's a lot of protest. And in this case, there was a protester. Um, she was in the car. The ICE officers told her to stop her car, get out. She didn't. She instead accelerated, and an ICE officer was in front of her. Whether he genuinely had a fear for his life, I mean, I guess that'll be established in any investigation. But Steve says import Somalis and you get Somalia. Yes, no question. I mean, if people come in with an attitude that the treasury, whether it's the state and the federal, and in the case of Somalia, it was both state and federal. Well, in the case of, sorry, not the Somalia state, in the case of welfare, whether it's health welfare, childcare welfare. So there's both state and federal money that was involved. So obviously you're going to come in and say, well, hey, there's free money, lying around. So hey, let me help myself to the goods. Yeah, you have absolutely. You bring in Somalia. What I found quite striking, and that still hasn't really been adequately explained, is these were I suppose they're these childcare centers. So therefore, they were supposed to look after children, and I had always assumed that when it comes to children, there is heightened scrutiny. So state, and federal officials would be extra careful that the children are being properly looked after. So there would be regular inspections, regular visits, regular inquiries about these childcare centers. I mean, you can't just allow people just to do some paperwork and say, "Yeah, we're going to run a childcare center. Now send us the money," and then no one from the state government ever bothered to inquire as to whether what was going on in these childcare centers. I mean, for all they knew, then there might have been widespread child abuse taking place in these centers. So it was just amazing that no one bothered to inquire as to what was happening. Anyway, that's Minnesota, and there's Jacob Fry. I mean, there's Jacob Fry, who again, you remember him, this insipid, weedy, repulsive figure, who when you looked at him back during the George Floyd um, moment, looked wholly inadequate for the position of mayor of Minneapolis, and he allowed the city to burn, and then worse, he ordered the abandonment of a precinct. I mean, can you imagine that the police just simply abandoned the precinct? Just unheard of. But that was Jacob Fry, and then Fry got himself reelected. How the hell do you reelect people like this? But there he is. He's back and doing his whole. But he's trying to be a tough guy. I mean, you look at him. He's anything but a tough guy. I mean, remember he was weeping at the memorial service for George Floyd. He sort of got down on his knees and started crying. And then, he's already shooting his mouth off, talking about that this was murder, when quite obviously it wasn't murder. I mean, it was a killing, and obviously it will be decided upon as to whether it was legally justifiable killing, which it probably will be determined, because police have a great deal of latitude in making arrests or making any kind of uh, investigations, in making any decisions on public order. And if you don't follow police instructions, then you're always in great danger of something unpleasant happening to you. And in this case, she clearly wasn't, and you can see it on the uh, the video that she wasn't following instructions. And then she drove, the car straight at the ICE officer. Now, so what I mean is going to be legally. They're going to say legally justifiable. He had um, clear, reasonable belief that she was driving a car at him. He only had, one tenth of a second to react, and so he shot her. But so when Jacob Fry comes along and says, "Oh, this was murder," and Waltz, I think, has also said, "Oh, this was murder," this then it's obviously a completely just an absurdity. I mean, it's a killing, and as I say, it will be determined whether it was legally justifiable. So I think it will be, um, because they say this was clearly a police operation. He had reasonable fear for his life, but even in other circumstances, um, you know, if you don't follow police instructions, you're always in grave danger. Now, whether it was, you can argue whether it was morally justifiable, well, that's of course a different question. But that isn't the decision that in these kinds of inquiries make. It's just, was this a reasonable, was this a legitimate use of force? And I think almost certainly that decision will go in favor of the ICE officer. But it is also very striking that that the people who are screaming and screaming, Waltz and Fry, I just can't take Fry. I mean, I can't take Waltz either, because they're just such hysterics. They're so, they're so hopelessly out of their depth in the positions that they hold. I mean, how could somebody like Fry be the mayor of a city, and and how could Waltz be the governor? I mean, this is a stolen valor guy. But okay. But the the thing is that when they whip up this fervor, and you get people getting very, very excited. Now, as I say, what is striking is the difference in the response to the killing of Ashley Babbitt. Now, you remember Ashley Babbitt? She was in the House of Congress on January 6, 2021, and then she was shot by that completely incompetent police officer. At the time, of course, everyone said, "Oh, this is entirely justifiable. Oh, entirely justifiable. Oh, just justifiable use of force." Now, that was, of course, far less justifiable because, um, the cop Michael Bird said that he had given instructions to Ashley Babbitt as she climbed through that window to stop, and she didn't stop, and therefore he shot her. Now, first of all, he was wearing a mask. If you recall, this was the heyday, the glory days of COVID, when everybody went around wearing those stupid masks. So if he did give instructions, which he claimed he did, and no one heard those instructions, but let's say he gave that instruction, and Ashley Babbitt would absolutely not have heard his instruction, because he had a mask on. So therefore you wouldn't have heard what he said, and there was a lot of commotion behind her, so she wouldn't have heard his instruction. Also, she was nowhere near Bird at the time, so Bird really had no basis on which to fear for his life. Leave aside the fact that she's just a slight woman. And in the case of um, this Miss Good, I mean, she was actually driving the car, and the ICE officer said, well, apparently that's going to be his claim, because that's the position taken by the administration, that he feared that she was going to drive the car straight at him. If you're driving a car at whatever 70 miles an hour, that is definitely a lethal weapon. So now, as I say, Bird really had no um, basis to fear for his life, and yet he used lethal force against Ashley Babbitt. Now, at the time, if you recall, everyone said, "Oh, this was perfect, totally justifiable use of force, totally justifiable." And therefore, it's absolutely outrageous that anybody should impugn um, Michael Bird's conduct. Then, of course, it turned out that Bird had disciplinary problems before, and yet was continued to serve on the Capitol police force. You remember he left his loaded gun in the men's room, and you would have thought, I mean, you leave your gun in the men's room, that would be automatic grounds for immediate dismissal. But in this case, I think he was just. I think he got. I don't know. He got a good talking to. They gave him a good tongue lashing, but he carried on the force. Um, but nonetheless, he wasn't prosecuted. There was investigation. Said, no, this was a legitimate use of force, and so that was that. Well, you see, you can't really have it. They want to have it every which way. So at the time, the same people who are screaming hysterically today were cheering on Michael Bird, and were attacking the journalists and commentators who were criticizing Michael Bird. Same with the whole issue of federal government versus state government. I mean, Fry and Waltz are both, we're not gonna comply with the demands of the federal government. They have, I think Fry, used the kind of an expletive, f off to ICE. But the point is that, first of all, under the U.S. Constitution, there is such a thing as, the supremacy clause. Federal government trumps state government. I mean, that's very obvious. But it's like, this the idea that somehow, remember, all of the indignation, that somehow Trump, then again, we're going back to 2020, 2021, that Trump was mounting an insurrection. He wasn't accepting the authority of the government. He wasn't accepting the authority of an election. But suddenly, apparently, you can just simply refuse to work with the federal government. Well, of course, you can't. And of course, that is lawlessness. So having attacked Trump and his supporters for lawlessness on January the 6th, so apparently it is, that's okay when Fry and Waltz refuse to work with the federal authorities, which they have to do. That's on the under the Constitution, under the law, they have to work with the federal government. They can't just tell the federal government to f off. But that's always the case. No one actually has ever is any principles in the matter. I don't know how many TV shows and movies you've watched over the years about the civil rights movement. And the gist of all of these TV shows and all the movies is that, well, you can't have state governments entrusted with law enforcement. The federal government had to step in. There was basically, but the minorities had to be protected, and only the federal government could do it. And so, the federal government were the heroes that stepped in to suppress the decisions of the state government. So, yeah, obviously you had Eisenhower in Little Rock when he sent in the National Guard. And of course, both Kennedy and Johnson also made use of the federal government, made use of the Insurrection Act, and sent in the federal, federalized the National Guard and sent them in because you can't rely on state government. So that's always been the sort of the heyday of liberalism. Oh, yes, that's wonderful. The federal government, that's it. We had to use the enlightened liberal federal government had to go in and protect minorities from the depredations of horrible, backward, primitive, antediluvian state governments. But now apparently, the federal government, you have to resist that. That's you can't have that. Even though, as I said, the Constitution is very clear: federal government trumps state government, and so when it comes to immigration, obviously that's a responsibility of the federal government, and you can't just simply say we're not going to cooperate in enforcing immigration law, which is a prerogative of the federal government. So that's that. So I've talked a little bit about it, but I'm finding the thing so insufferable because the because the people take these positions. It's never based on any principle other than we're supporting our side and we're against their side. And then you kind of try to wrap this up, this completely unprincipled approach, by as if you really care about rights and so on. So was it Schlumbucket Return says bad police work often creates situations where deadly force becomes necessary, but if police just approach the situations better, they don't create those deadly situations. Well, I mean, yes, you're right. However, one has to know that in all circumstances, in every country, you do what the police tell you. Don't get into an argument with the police. Don't get into a fight with the police. If they tell you go over to the other side of the road, if they tell you can't stand here because you're blocking this entrance, or you can't stand that, you just have to accept it. If you don't accept it, then the situation could suddenly escalate, and that does lead to bad events. Now, of course, you don't deserve it. No one deserves to get killed over a protest. But in this case, I mean, they told her to stop the car and get out of the car. I mean, you have to follow that instruction. I mean, you cannot do it. If you try to run away from the police, you're always running a huge risk of violence. You just can't run away from them in any circumstances. And in this case, if she indeed was driving the car at the ICE officer, then it's that it does indeed, it is going to end tragically. And of course, yeah, she's a mother of 3 children. In which case, again, one has to say, if you're a mother of 3 young children, you really shouldn't get yourself into a situation where you might you might get seriously hurt. Somebody else might get seriously hurt. You might get prosecuted. I mean, there's just shouldn't be doing this. So anyway, now segue into the events of yesterday. If you recall the seizure of the Russian flagged ship. And as always, there's already a coping mechanism. So, basically, this is a total humiliation. The United States and the United Kingdom jointly seized a Russian vessel. And because supposedly it had tried to break the U.S. imposed blockade on Venezuela, so that it wasn't actually doing anything illegal. Whatever U.S. court orders say. I mean, basically, the ship wasn't doing anything illegal. These U.S. court orders, have some validity in the United States. They don't actually have validity on the high seas, and certainly not on a ship. I can't remember how many thousands of miles away from the United States. So this was obviously a power play by the Trump administration, because they wanted to show to Russia who's the boss. And so, you have to then say, well, how is Russia going to respond to this obvious insult? And I said it during the podcast, was that, well, Russia has to respond very firmly, because if it doesn't, then this is going to happen again and again and again. And that means, one ship after another will be seized. Sometimes they'll be empty, sometimes they'll be carrying oil, but the one ship after another is going to be seized. And so, what you don't want to do, that's what I said yesterday, what you don't want to do is start talking about international law. Because everybody knows, of course, it's a violation of international law. U.S. domestic law does not apply in other countries. It certainly doesn't apply in the northeastern Atlantic. And so a lot would depend on how Russia would respond. And indeed, Russia did respond today by issuing a lengthy statement, which, however, was, I think, rather inadequate, precisely because it did what I said that they shouldn't do, which is to start talking about international law as if anybody is interested in international law, least of all the United States. So here, let me just get this out. The statement from the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry. And here you have, this is the Foreign Ministry statement regarding the forcible seizure of the oil tanker. And he says, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs expresses grave concern over the illegal use of force by the United States Armed Forces against the oil tanker Marinera on January the 7th. The Marinera, which was temporarily authorized to fly the Russian flag on December the 24th, in accordance with international and Russian law, was transiting peacefully through international waters of the North Atlantic en route to a Russian port. U.S. authorities, including through official communications with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, were repeatedly provided with reliable information confirming the vessel's Russian registration and its civilian non-military status. There could have been no doubt regarding this fact, nor any basis for alleging that the tanker was sailing without a flag or under a false flag. And then it says, international maritime law explicitly grants the flag state exclusive jurisdiction over its vessels on the high seas. Stopping and inspecting a vessel in international waters is permitted only under narrowly defined circumstances, such as suspected piracy or slave trading, neither of which apply to the marinera. In all other cases, such actions require the consent of the flag state, which in this instance is Russia. And so keep in mind, Russia had, issued a warning or expressed concern over the fact that this empty tanker was being tracked by the U.S. Coast Guard, and they indeed released a video of this tracking, and RT posted this video. So the Russians were explicit about this. Um, and but nonetheless, the tracking continued, and then they indeed went so far as to seize the boat. And here we have so it says, not only did Russia refuse to provide such consent, it formally protested to U.S. authorities in recent weeks over the continued pursuit of the Marinera by a U.S. Coast Guard vessel, demanding an immediate end to the pursuit and the withdrawal of unlawful demands made to the Russian ship's captain. Under these circumstances, the boarding and de facto seizure of a civilian vessel on the high seas by U.S. military personnel, along with the detention of its crew, can only be viewed as a gross violation of fundamental principles and norms of international maritime law and the freedom of navigation. Right. I mean, all this absolute agreement. No disputing this determination. The question is, does anyone care? Does the United States care? Does the United Kingdom care? Does NATO care? Of course they don't. I mean, all that talk about the rules-based international order, it's just that. It's talk. Everyone has always known that it's talk. And yeah, of course, these very same people that you have in the past condemned for bombing country in this country or that country, that you have condemned for organizing color revolutions in this country or that country, invading this country or that country. You expect those countries now to uphold international law? I mean, the same people who you always say lie to your face over and over and over again, starting from James Baker's Not 1 Inch to the East, and then all the lies about at the time of the Maidan overthrow of Yanukovych, and then Minsk. We're familiar with the list. I mean, the Russians are always bringing up this list. Now you expect them to adhere to international maritime law? This constitutes a serious infringement upon the legitimate rights and interests of the ship owner. Okay. The lives and health of the Marinera crew, which includes citizens of several countries, are now at risk. We consider the threats of legal action against them on absurd grounds by U.S. authorities to be utterly unacceptable. Oh, that's unacceptable. That's good. Moreover, by conducting an unsafe pursuit and armed seizure of an oil tanker in severe weather conditions, U.S. forces demonstrably disregarded the danger of causing significant environmental damage to the North Atlantic. Yeah, like blowing up Nord Stream was also not really in conformity with international environmental law. It's the biggest environmental calamity, really, and I don't know how long. And no one really seemed to care that much about it. Once it became clear that you couldn't accuse Russia of blowing up its own pipelines, then very quickly the Western media dropped the subject. And so they thought, oh well, there's the environment, danger to the environment. Yeah, okay, well, that's danger to the environment. Anyway, so this goes on a little bit more, um, and yeah, we so this is the references by the United States to its domestic sanctions legislation are without legal foundation. Yes, that's the thing. The sanctions only have any legal basis if they're ordered by the UN Security Council. You could say they have legal basis, but even then it is doubtful. But at least it has some legal basis. But any country unilaterally imposing sanctions, that has no legal foundation, because as we were discussing the other day, because of the sovereign equality of states. You can't just simply impose your laws on the laws of another country. That's what sovereign equality means. And those are your laws. They apply to you, to your citizens. They don't apply to us, and they don't apply to anyone else. Um, the unilateral restrictive measures imposed by the US and other Western countries are illegitimate and cannot justify attempts to assert jurisdiction, let alone the seizure of vessels on the high seas. Suggestions from certain US officials that the seizure of the Marinera is part of a broader strategy to establish Washington's unlimited control over Venezuela's natural resources are profoundly cynical. We categorically reject such neo-colonial ambitions. Um, well, that's a very interesting one. I mean, obviously, you can reject your neo-colonial ambitions, um, but you have a particular problem um, that Russia faces, which is that, I mean, leave aside obviously that it lost the East European buffer states that had been members of the Warsaw Pact and had provided security for the Soviet Union since World War II until 1991. So they lost all that. Every single one of those Warsaw Pact states, every single one, is now a member of NATO. So obviously that was a problem. But what's now happening is that Russia is losing its influence within among the states that had been a part of the Soviet Union. I mean, it comprised 15 republics. Now, three of them, the Baltic states, are obviously members of NATO, so that's gone. And then you have Ukraine, where this is clearly the red line for Russia. So that's there's a war there. Moldova is a kind of de facto member of NATO, a de facto member of the EU. I see, just Marty has always introduces himself with a great meme. So in this case, it's a photograph of Trump aboard Air Force One, and alongside him is Lindsey Graham, Lady Lindsey, and Trump in this picture is looking at him rather warily, and that I think brings up an interesting question, which I want to get to, which is how did Trump essentially become John McCain? Because this Trump, I mean, not only is he not the peace president, but he's John McCain. I mean, this what he's now doing in his aggressiveness and his recklessness. This is John McCain stuff, and that's why wherever you go now with Trump, there's Lazy Lindsay next to him, because essentially Lindsay is now the kind of the guiding light of the of his foreign policy. But anyway, I mean, just going back to Russia. Um, But where this becomes a serious problem is that Armenia and Azerbaijan have now drifted away from Russia. I mean, Armenia and Azerbaijan were in the Oval Office. Remember, a few months ago, signing some kind of an agreement, and they were both hailing Trump um, as the peacemaker. He brought peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, basically, Azerbaijan took over Nagorno-Karabakh, and they didn't bother to ask permission from Russia to do so. That's not a good situation, because this is Russia's backyard. I mean, this is one where Russia has to have. Well, it was assumed Russia would have the decisive say in what happens in its near abroad. So whether for Putin to say about Nagorno Karabakh, well, we told Armenia to be more accommodating, and we offered to help Armenia. They didn't want our help, and blah 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 blah. Um, it's Russia who has to decide what happens. Is that what Russia wanted? Did Russia want Nagorno Karabakh to be taken over by Azerbaijan? Was that Russian policy? Putin never told us that was Russian policy. He just said, "Well, what could we do about it?" I mean, Pashinyan, the Armenian leader, he didn't want our help. Well, that's not good enough. I mean, it's this is your backyard. If you think that Azerbaijan should take over Nagorno-Karabakh, then you should say that that's your policy, rather than Turkey and Azerbaijan simply making it a fait accompli, and then Russia accepts it as a fait accompli and then blames everything on Armenia. And then you're surprised why Armenia is essentially kind of completely drifted away from Russia, and it's still theoretically a member state of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but it doesn't really take any part in any of the CSTO activities. So that's Armenia, that's Azerbaijan gone, and then you have Kazakhstan, which is even as we speak negotiating with the United States for the takeover of Russia's Lukoil in Kazakhstan. So you go on about neo-colonialism. You want to be practicing a little bit more of neo-colonialism, just simply rather than kind of turning the other cheek and allowing your former, these are your former allies, these are your former member states of the USSR. They were part of the Russian Empire, essentially be, moving into the NATO United States orbit. So you want to be thinking about some neo-colonialism right now. But anyway, let's just finish off that Russian statement, and then this is the alongside the U.S. administration's disregard for the accepted norms of international maritime navigation, Washington's readiness to provoke acute international crises, including in Russian-American relations, which are already severely strained, is both regrettable and alarming. The Marinera incident can only lead to a further escalation of military-political tensions in the Euro-Atlantic region and dangerous lowering of the threshold for using force against civilian shipping. Well, that threshold no longer exists, so therefore there's no point in even talking about it yet. Encouraged by Washington's irresponsible example, other actors may feel emboldened to take similar actions. You think? Authorities in the United Kingdom, a country with a long history of maritime predation, are already displaying such intent, having openly acknowledged their involvement in the U.S. military operation in North Atlantic waters. And then we call on Washington to return to the established norms and principles of international maritime law, and to immediately cease its unlawful actions against the Marinera and other vessels engaged in lawful activities on the high seas. We reiterate our demand that the United States ensure appropriate and humane treatment of the Russian citizens on board, fully respect their rights, and facilitate their swift return home. So now you can see what they've done here is they've acknowledged that there were Russian citizens on board. They've acknowledged that these Russian citizens are under arrest, and they're not coming back anytime soon. The Americans aren't going to release these Russian citizens anytime you know, in the next few days or next few weeks. So the problem is that the only thing that could make a difference is some very similar actions on the part of the you just seize an American ship, preferably an American boat carrying oil. I mean, if they, let's say, since they feel so strongly about neocolonialism in Venezuela, they should, because this Trump policy now is that they're going to be shipping out oil. We'll talk about it in a minute. They're going to be shipping out oil out of Venezuela to refineries in the United States, and then they're going to sell the oil and then decide how much of that revenue from the sales should be given to Venezuela and how much the Americans should keep. But since the Russians sees this as neocolonialism, I mean, some kind of and it's nice to bring back, these happy cliches of the Soviet era, neocolonialism. Love hearing that expression again. But since Russia feels strongly about that, then they should seize one of these ships with carrying oil, and then tow it back to a Russian port and say, "Hey, this is illegal. This is really illegal. This is illicit activity. This is theft of Venezuela's oil, which it is." And we're not going to tolerate it. We're not going to. It's unacceptable that one country should steal the natural resources of another country. And then that would be a very principled stance, a far more principled stance, incidentally, than anything that the United States has done. But that's the only thing that's going to make any difference. Now, of course, if you do something like that, then that does carry risks. I mean, you don't know, particularly with Trump, you don't know how he's going to react. So that there is that risk. But of course, if you don't do anything, if you just let it go, then you do know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to do this again, and they're going to do it again and again and again until they score some spectacular success. So, we had the assassination attempt on Putin. That was 2 weeks ago, and what happened about that? So they had we talked about this when we had the sequence of events. We had the meeting in Mar-a-Lago. Zelensky was there. Before the Zelensky meeting, Trump put in a phone call with Putin. And then after the phone call, or at the end of the phone call, Trump promised Putin, "I'm going to call you back after I've talked to Zelensky and the Europeans are going to be in on the on their call." So he told Putin, "Yeah, well, stay on the line. I'll call you back in a couple of hours." And then, of course, we had the assassination attempt. So somebody knew where Putin was, and somebody launched drones on Putin. Now, this was the Russians who said this. So this isn't, me or anyone else, podcaster or somebody on Telegram channel or a blogger or anyone else that said, "Oh, this was an assassination attempt." It's the Russians themselves who said this was an assassination attempt on Putin. It's they made that claim. No one else. They made that claim. And then when they spoke to Trump the next day, Trump expressed, shock, appalling. This is appalling, or whatever. Though in itself was kind of ridiculous because it's shocking and appalling. Well, that means Ukraine did this. At least, that's who the Russians said it. It was a Ukrainian attack. So if you were so shocked and appalled by what Ukraine had done, wouldn't the remedy be, well, now I'm cutting Ukraine off? That's it. You're on your own, pal. I can't be involved in assassination attempts on the leaders of nuclear power. But Trump didn't do that. He just said, well, I'm just shocked and appalled. And then 2 days later, he tweeted out, truthed out that stupid New York Post editorial, which said, "Oh, it was all a lie. It was a Putin lie. He just lied about this. It didn't happen." So, and now Trump has officially said he doesn't think that it happened. Now, and the Russians, they gathered the evidence and they said, "Whoa, we're presenting it to the Americans." And we saw the photographs of Russia presenting the evidence to the American military attaché at the embassy. Well, so we presented the Americans with the evidence. Well, what kind of what difference is that going to make? You really think the Americans are going to look at the evidence? They know what happened. The Americans already know what happened. They don't need to look at any evidence. That evidence that the Russians presented to the military attaché, that went straight into the waste paper basket. That went boom. As soon as they were out of the Russian defense ministry, boom, waste paper basket. They weren't going to bother to look at the evidence. So that's an assassination attempt. It's an assassination attempt. The Russians have claimed that Ukraine tried to kill Putin, and Ukraine and Russia has always said correctly that any kind of long distance attacks by Ukraine that requires targeting information, requires satellite guidance, and only the Americans can provide it. So if this was indeed as an assassination attempt, as the Russians claim it was, then the United States had to have been in on it, including possibly Trump himself. We don't know, but it's quite it's not. I mean, if you have a murder conspiracy, you don't know who was in on it. So that's gone. That's already whatever in the history books. Now they've seized a ship, and there's no real response from Russia, which means that the United States will think, well, we can get away with anything. And we already know Trump has a very low opinion of Russia. I mean, he's now said it's over and over and over again. That somehow, we can pull these things off. What we did with Maduro, and Russia can't. Russia's dawdling in Ukraine. No one knows exactly where that's going, how long that war is going to go on. It's costing enormous number of lives, and they say, I don't know what you're doing here. Well, we wouldn't have done that. So, given that Trump obviously does not have a particularly high opinion of Russia, doesn't have a particularly high opinion of Putin. He used to, but he obviously doesn't have a high opinion of him now. Then you could be absolutely certain that there's going to be more and more of this, and including assassination attempts. And then you'd have to think there's going to be assassination attempts, and at some point, one of them is going to work. One of them will succeed. And of course, when that happens, then of course there'll be celebrations, congratulations. among the Western powers. And so the same powers who today claiming, oh, it was all made up. There was no attempt to assassinate Putin. There was no one tried anything. No one did anything. All made up by the Russians. It's full fake news. It's lies by the Russians. Will then be celebrating and say, yeah, I did that. Trump will say, yeah, I gave the go ahead. I did it. It was me. Yeah, and the British were in on it. So they helped us. The French were in on it. Well, they helped us too. Yeah. But basically it was us. Um, and that's that's it. Now, I kind of looked through the various I guess the bloggers, the tweeters, and they of course doing the whole mechanism. Well, this was really very very unimportant. It's just I mean it's just an empty rusting vessel. Who the hell cares? Let the Americans waste energy seizing a decrepit old vessel. It's no biggie. Um, and then because Russia is just inexorably marching towards victory. None of this matters. Because they said the same thing after the attack on the Russian strategic bombers. No biggie. Nothing to worry about here because Russia is still marching on to victory. Well, um, this is a war on many different fronts, and you can't just simply take it as we're marching on this particular front, and we're only going to pay attention to what's going on this front, because you have to think about all the other things, all the other attacks that are taking place on Russia, including the attacks on its finances, attacks on its oil industry, um, and indeed the terrorist acts and the assassination attempts, the seizure of tankers, and all of the rest. This is all part of the um, war that is going on. And as I've said before, even if Russia marches through and finally takes Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporozhye, I mean, whenever that might be, let's say they do it. That doesn't really um, bring the war to an end. You really think NATO's going to end the war just then? NATO was just simply say, "Well, okay, well, that's it. We this is lost. We're not going to, we're going to accept the loss of this of the Donbass, and now we're going to work with the Russians." Of course, they're not going to do that. They're not going to accept it. So even if Russia marches on and takes the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye, the war goes on. And they're going to do it, continued attacks on the Donbass, continued attacks on Russia, and again, through subversion, terrorism, all the rest. They're going to continue with it. And even if Russia says, we're not going to put up with it, we're going to march on to Kiev. Though I don't know how they're going to do it without ordering a full mobilization. But let's say they're going to do that and say, we're going to march to Kiev. We're going to take Kiev. And they go on and they do indeed march onto Kiev and they take Kiev. That's not going to bring the war to an end. NATO will just find other ways to keep the war going. They're going to start a guerrilla war, a permanent guerrilla war from a number of neighboring states. Poland primarily, Moldova, and they will just keep this war going. This is just going to go on and on and on. And I said, the manpower. As I said, There's no shortage of manpower in the world. If you have a mind to it, if you have a mind to it, you will find the manpower. A lot of people in the world, a lot of hungry people in the world, you dangle some money in front of them. Mercenaries, there's never been a problem in history to find mercenaries. You can always go, as I said, Africa has a population surplus. They have too many people there. It's not hard to find mercenaries. In other words, if you want to keep the war going, you will be able to keep the war going. Um, so that's it. And so the question is then how they that Russia so far has done the usual thing, which is to start talking about international law when they already know that the people that they're dealing with couldn't care less about international law. So to whom are they trying to appeal? Who exactly is going to be sitting there and saying, "Oh, well, that was, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. That this is about it's international law." So that's just a complete waste of time. And but and they're still now stuck in this mindset of of extolling the virtues of Trump. So Trump, oh well, he's somebody who we can deal with. This is a serious people. They're concerned only with their national interest. So this is, they talk about the spirit of anchorage. Can you imagine talking such nonsense about the spirit of anchorage? And then, what are these characters? I mean, a lot of these people who write, particularly some of the people who are around Napolitano, and well, Russians have now finally said, given up on negotiations. Oh, they're not going to negotiate anymore with Trump. No, that's it. They find Russia has now said, we're just going to go on, doing whatever we're doing. No more negotiations with Trump. Right. Until the next time Kirill Dmitriev meets with um, Steve Witkoff. And then once again, they'll be talking about, we're going to have another meeting, and then we're going to talk about a new plan, and we're going to go and move along. Has Kirill Dmitriev ever said that, well, that's it, negotiations are over. We're not going to talk anymore. They still continue. They're still going to continue talking. So, but I think the point here is that with Trump, and particularly now they haven't emboldened Trump because Trump is really riding high after the Venezuela caper, that he's going to start taking more and more risks, and particularly as he doesn't really think terribly highly of Russia, thinks Russia's weak. Russia hasn't responded to him, and so that's now one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the situation, of course, in Venezuela is kind of interesting because the because well, I mean, we still don't fully understand why Trump did what he did, because we took it, obviously it was axiomatic that it wasn't about drugs. Venezuela wasn't a major player when it came to drugs, and so we said, oh well, it's regime change, but he hasn't really embraced regime change, because while he's removed Maduro, and as I say, in a kind of bizarre way of bringing him to supposedly to justice in the United States. In other words, he's now asserting a kind of universal jurisdiction, the kind of thing that you would have thought Trump, a populist conservative, wouldn't have anything to do with. So he asserts that. It's now before a judge, a 92-year-old judge in in New York, a 92 a liberal judge. This is a judge appointed by Bill Clinton. So that was, Trump is essentially signing off on this kind of lawfare, which is what it is. Lawfare, which is the bailiwick of liberals. And why is it bailiwick? Because most lawyers are liberals, and then they use the law in order to acquire power. So that's why lawfare, whether on a national level, which was used against him, Trump tried to send him to prison, tried to keep him off the ballot. All of that was used against Trump domestically. But of course, that kind of lawfare is used internationally. Mostly, I mean, the people who love this kind of thing would absolutely, if they had a chance, would use it against the United States. Um, and but that now Trump is, was always this 92-year-old Orthodox Jew appointed by Bill Clinton. So now that's it. So that's what Trump has accomplished. So that doesn't really make much sense. And then, of course, you have the usual kind of leftish types who said, "Yeah, it's about the oil, it's the oil. They want the oil." Now, that it makes really very little sense. Because I mean, they tried to make that argument against, in the case of Saddam Hussein, that it was about the oil, but it's never really made very much sense, because even in the case of Saddam Hussein either, because there's no shortage of oil in the world. There's an oil glut. If you're worried about oil, then just lift sanctions and allow people to sell oil. But of course, what then would happen if you let people sell oil is that the price of oil would plunge it'll virtually be worth nothing. And of course, if the oil is worth nothing, then of course the oil majors aren't really making any money. So the problem now is not extracting oil and selling oil. The problem now is, well, how do we restrict oil, because there's just too much oil. I mean, it's already, the price of oil is so low that it just makes no sense for the oil majors to invest more money in the oil industry. So this is, so therefore it really makes very little sense. I mean, so the those who say, oh, it's all about the oil, they're kind of living in this world of the 1970s, that whole Club of Rome and stuff about somehow natural resources are going to run out, or we're going to run out of oil, we're not going to have anything. And so there's this real scarcity of natural resources. There's no scarcity of natural resources. There's no scarcity of food, no scarcity of coal, no scarcity, there's just no scarcity of oil. None of these are in any way scarce. So Trump's plan, to apparently is, well, he's going to take this oil, sell it, and then share the revenue, whatever, with Venezuela. All right, so it'll be like the oil for food program with Saddam Hussein, which was introduced in the late 1990s when they saw the real hardship that the sanctions were causing in Iraq. But that isn't all right. Even if he does that, Trump has also promised that he's going to get his oil industry friends to invest in Venezuela. But they're not very interested in investing in Venezuela for the reason that I just said. That they would have to invest a lot of money. Yes, Venezuela has, in theory, and these are all theoretical, what the size of its oil reserves are, because we just simply don't know. I mean, these are all essentially, purely theoretical. What the potential reserves of Venezuela are. But either way, um, Venezuela's oil is, it's this heavy crude. Takes a little bit of investment to get out of the ground, and it has to be refined elsewhere. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for the oil majors to invest in Venezuela when they can get oil much less expensively elsewhere, including through shale oil, which is in the United States. So the United States is already, the biggest oil producer in the world, an oil exporter. So there's no need for Venezuela's oil. So that was here. There was an interesting article about this in the Financial Times. Let me find this. And first, well, this is Trump's announcement. I'm pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. That's actually nothing, 30 to 50 million. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but it's nothing, basically. This oil will be sold at its market price, and that money will be controlled by me as the President of the United States, to ensure it is used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States. I have asked Energy Secretary Chris Wright to execute the plan immediately. It will be taken by storage ships and brought directly to unloading docks in the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Um, so this is the transfer of oil that I said the Russians should actually get their hands on this oil, take it back to Russia and say, hey, this is stolen. This is stolen property, stolen from the people of Venezuela. Anyway, so that was Trump's truth. And then there's an article in the Financial Times which says U.S. oil groups warn they will need guarantees to invest in Venezuela. So Trump is going to have these oil majors around. I think it's in the Oval Office on Friday, and he's going to try and persuade them to invest in Venezuela. But they're not much inclined to invest unless the United States government issues them with guarantees. So if that does happen, then it's a wonderful transfer of wealth from the less well off in the United States to the more well off, namely the oil companies, because they said we're not going in without guarantees. In other words, we're going to stick the U.S. government with the bill for this investment. So as U.S. oil companies want, quote, serious guarantees from Washington before they make splashy investments in Venezuela, as President Donald Trump urges them to back his bid to reshape energy markets. And then American officials held crunch talks with top energy executives in Miami on Wednesday, just as Trump made a show of raw power over global crude markets, seizing control of Venezuela's oil sector and ordering U.S. special forces to capture a Russian tanker in the North Atlantic. Trump has also summoned executives from some of the country's biggest energy groups to a meeting at the White House on Friday. And then the executives are expected to press the president on providing strong legal and financial guarantees. That's it. Operative word is the financial guarantees before they agree to commit capital to Venezuela. Earlier this week, Trump said the American oil companies could be reimbursed by us or through revenue if they invested in Venezuela. But executives remain cautious, with some citing erratic policymakers and policymaking. The discussions in Miami on Wednesday came just hours after Trump said Venezuela would surrender millions of barrels of oil. And then it goes on. But Trump's plan to revive Venezuela's oil sector has already met with skepticism among U.S. executives who say political and legal risks coupled with low oil prices are obstacles. Well, low oil prices, because there's an oil glut. Everybody produces oil. It's the easiest thing in the world to produce oil. And then you've got the sanctions on Iran. Now imagine if Iran were able to sell its oil, because Trump wants to, let's say he wants to overthrow the government in Tehran, and then of course there'll be the question. Well, now they'll be able to sell their oil, so that's going to drive oil prices down even lower. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright met senior officials from Chevron and ConocoPhillips, delivering Trump's message that America's biggest oil groups must pour billions of dollars into Venezuela's battered energy industry. Executives from the biggest U.S. oil groups, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips, are among those expected to meet Trump at the White House on Friday. And then here's another article in the FT. Says Washington seeks to control sales of Venezuela oil indefinitely. And then the U.S. says it will seek to control Venezuela oil sales indefinitely, funnel the proceeds to American companies, and open the country to U.S. oil services groups, such as Washington steps up its efforts to reshape the resource-rich nation. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said the U.S. would sell crude in storage in Venezuela and fresh production from the country to American refineries. We're going to let the oil flow. Wright told energy executives gathered at Goldman Sachs Energy Conference in Miami. And then, and this way, the Venezuela State Oil Company said on Wednesday that it was still in negotiations with Washington to sell volumes of crude oil. This process is being carried out under schemes similar to those currently in place with international companies such as Chevron. It is based on strictly commercial transaction. So the point is that we look at this again, and this really doesn't make a great deal of sense. So Maduro, who was willing to work with the United States, we know that there were negotiations between Maduro and Trump to give the Americans a big stake in Venezuela's oil industry. Trump said, "Oh no, I'm not interested in that. I want Maduro gone." And then, Trump then suddenly invented this whole issue about drugs, which is always laughable. And then he suddenly invented this whole issue of, well, now we're going to have the oil. And by doing so, of course, he, allowed the sort of all the sort of lefty types, the Bernie Sanders, and we always said it was all about the oil. Oh, about the oil. But as we see, there are no takers. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants to invest in Venezuela's oil industry because there's no reason for it. There's an enormous amount of investment that's involved in trying to extract extra oil out of Venezuela, and the price of oil, the world price of oil, simply doesn't justify that kind of an investment. I mean, you have to make some money. I mean, these people they're not charities; they have to make some money. And if the world oil prices continue to sink, and they sank even today. The news about Trump's plans to start extracting oil from Venezuela, so they sank even lower. Then no one's going to do it. So why did Trump do this? Why did he remove Maduro? I mean, it's still, whenever we've had these kinds of these color revolutions in the past, you could always at least answer the question, well, why did they do it? Why did they remove Milosevic? Well, Milosevic was a challenge to NATO. He didn't want to go down the path of NATO. He wanted to pursue neutrality. I think he wanted to pursue good relations with Russia, and therefore for the United States, for NATO, Milosevic was an annoyance. And to some extent, the Milosevic policy has continued. Serbia still refuses to join NATO, and that just drives NATO and the EU crazy. And hence the constant negative coverage of Serb President Vucic. So at least, okay, say they were under the impression that if you get rid of Milosevic, we'll get our pro-Western toadies in power, which they did, and then Serbia will be brought in to the NATO mainstream, and so these toadies kind of they more or less did what was expected of them. They finally dissolved Yugoslavia. That's what they wanted. So Yugoslavia ceased to exist, and they were kind of ready, basically just to surrender Kosovo. But the Serbs refused to go along with it. So then they thought, okay, well, we'll try it with the nationalist conservatives. Maybe the nationalist conservatives, rather than these Western liberals, will be more amenable to our plans. But that hasn't worked either. So, but at least if you say, well, why did they get rid of Milosevic? Yeah, I can see why. Why did they get rid of Gaddafi? Um, so maybe they thought that this would cause a kind of color revolutions through the Arab world, and then they would basically have pro Western regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Um, I mean, Gaddafi had been a thorn in the side of the West for many years. I mean, ever since he seized power in a coup in, I think, 1969. So at least I can say, okay, well, I can roughly figure out why they want to get rid of uh, Gaddafi. Assad, okay, and the why would they want to get rid of Assad? Okay, that makes a little more sense. He's an ally of Russia. He's an ally of Iran. It's basically Russia and Iran's footprint in the Middle East. If you can get rid of Assad, then you eliminate Russia from the scene. You greatly diminish Iran, and that has actually worked. I mean, that has actually succeeded. I mean, it clearly has weakened Russia's position. It's obviously weakened the position of uh, Iran and Hezbollah. Um, but with Maduro, it's just still not very clear what the purpose of this regime change, which isn't really a regime change. Um, and so it's one has to conclude that Trump has just embraced the John McCain um, the method of thinking about the world. Just, well, wherever you see a government, we need to topple it. If it's not completely aligned with us, we have to topple it. And so that's I think that's the only thing, and that's why when Marty presented that picture of Lady Lindsay, next to Trump, it's like Trump is suddenly he's now part of the McCain Graham team. That's it. Yeah, we're gonna overthrow this government. We're gonna overthrow that government. We're gonna, without any real rhyme or reason, thinking, oh well, we'll get some pro-Western rulers maybe down the road. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason for doing this. Anyway, let's take a look at our Gaggle locals page. This is where the Gagglers meet and share ideas, and above all, it's where the Gagglers kind of express their their friendly feelings towards the dogs, who kind of make the whole thing um, you know reasonable. They're the ones who actually do all the work and keep the gaggle going. So that's always really appreciated. And anyway, let's take a look at the comments from and questions from gagglers, and let me go back at the beginning. Okay, so Stone River, thank you very much, Stone River. As always, was very very generous of you, and so. Stone River says, George, it seems to me that there are two possible interpretations of recent events. The Trump-led U.S. intends to run the Western Hemisphere. So that's how they expressed their desires in that national security strategy document. Okay, or it intends to run the world global hegemony. Which, if either, do you lean towards? Well, that's a really really good question. As I say, the first option at least has a certain logic to it. I mean, I can say, okay, that's he wants to do it. Basically, no one can stop the United States asserting its dominance over the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, the United States had tried this before. They tried it in the under one president after another, and generally, it was quite successful. I don't know how many of these interventions that take place, the interventions in Nicaragua, the interventions in Haiti, Dominican Republic. I mean, just one intervention after another. And then there were the coups and everything else. So long tradition of all of that. So Trump didn't really invent anything very much. So that at least has a certain logic to it. And it's possible that now, with Russia greatly diminished, he would have success. After all, the concern that existed with Eisenhower when Castro took power was that this kind of radicalism would spread to Latin America, and suddenly, America would have all these lefties to deal with, and that's why they became very preoccupied with Castro, and then they they basically there was a deal. The United States and the Soviet Union came to an agreement after the Cuban Missile Crisis that there will be no more U.S. invasions of Cuba, and the Americans more or less had kept to that. They've tried, of course, to overthrow Castro. They tried to assassinate Castro, but there were no more attempts to invade Cuba. But now Cuba is greatly weakened, and you could see Trump now thinking, "Hey, we can get Cuban in our bloc. That's going to keep all the Miami Cubans satisfied. And then we can get rid of Ortega, and then we have Lula. That'll put pressure on Lula in Brazil, and then essentially Latin and Central America will be run by Milei types, all adhering to the United States. Nothing ever works out like that, but I can see Trump's thinking. Now, the alternative, as you said, which is the global hegemony, that is the one that seems to be coming more to the fore, because this attempt to seize this Russian ship and a desire to weaken Russia, that shows kind of global ambition, and it seems like Trump, isn't really content with just, oh well, this is our Western Hemisphere, and then we'll allow China to become the dominant power in Asia, and then we'll allow Russia to restore its power in its near abroad and its in Eastern Europe and so on. Trump isn't going to go for any of that. So I would say, which one is it? I'd say now it's more the latter. I think it's more that he's decided, so overwhelming is American power, so much stronger is the United States than any rival or combination of rivals, that why not go for global rule? And right now, I'd say that the resistance to the United States is probably at its weakest in a long time. If you think about uh, Iran, really, I mean, can one really be optimistic about the survival of Iran? I wouldn't be. I would think that an attack on Iran is on the cards with certainly with Israel, but Israel jointly with the United States. I mean, again, with Lady Lindsay telling Trump, Iran is really weak now. Why not just go for it? Now, we don't know exactly how they would try to do it with Iran. They have all sorts of options at their disposal, um, such as um, instigating irredentist movements in Iran, um, instigating riots in Iran. Um, then they have a lot of things that they can do to weaken the government of Iran. Iran really doesn't does not want to get into any kind of a confrontation with the United States, and it's understandable because they don't really have anyone in their corner. Iran knows Russia's not going to do anything on its behalf. I mean, that's it. I mean, Russia's not going to come in and do it, in any way, shape, or form for Iran. So Iran is really on its own. China's not going to do anything. So you can see that Iran is really up against it. So there's Lady Lindsay is telling him, hey, this is it. This revolution, the 1979 revolution. This could be the moment to give it one big push, and it's going to fall. I'm not saying that will succeed, but I can easily imagine Trump going for it. As I say, I don't necessarily think they're going to, at least the United States bombing Iran. I think that's too risky for the United States. But whipping up, irredentist movements, power plays. I mean, Iran is obviously thoroughly penetrated by Western intelligence. I mean, it's just, I mean, I mean, it's clear even from all of those attacks that have taken place when Israel launched its attacks, that Israel has a lot of absolutely accurate information. Probably they got it from the Americans about where everything is in Iran. So it's thoroughly penetrated by Western intelligence, and they could absolutely start instigating, as it's happening now, instigating these various riots throughout the country, and the government so far has seemed very weak in its response. Um, so and the United States can start making life difficult for China with Taiwan. Just give them headaches. It's like the American position. I give you headaches. You don't give me headaches. So I say that national security strategy document was sounded. That's great, but I think Trump's ambition is far more extensive, and what we're seeing now is the whole story about multipolarity and so on. It's just a lot of hot air. It was always hot air. We are still more or less in the unipolar moment. Things don't change that quickly. I mean, it seemed like all the 90s, unipolar moment. Oh, but that all changed. Now we've got Russia and we've got China. It's still basically unipolar. The Russia and China aren't able to influence events to their advantage. So the axis of resistance is it's a lot weaker than we were led to believe. Anyway, thank you, Stone River. It's a really interesting question. And then Robert, always good to see you, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert. Um, and is it possible to say whether Aldrich Ames was truly motivated by skepticism toward the CIA and U.S. policy, or whether that was a narrative trotted out as cover for Soviet cash for intelligence? Well, I tend to think that in his case, it was mostly cash. I didn't get any sense with him um, that this business of skepticism, and I certainly didn't think that he was in any way motivated by, I know, ideological beliefs. Somehow that Soviet Union represented a higher stage of civilization, or anything in the way that was the earlier generation of spies who were more or less driven by some kind of ideology. I didn't get that sense with Aldrich Ames. Um, it's it's I mean, one thing that was always interesting was that the CIA had always believed forever. I mean, it was always a cardinal belief on the part of the CIA that it had never been penetrated by any hostile intelligence service. Absolutely said this, and Angleton, who was obsessed. He became very obsessed with the Soviet machinations after he was after it turned out that Kim Philby, who had exactly the same position as Angleton had within the CIA. Angleton had been head of counterintelligence within the CIA, and of course Philby had been head of counterintelligence within MI6. And Philby and Angleton were very good friends. Philby was in Washington, and they really enjoyed one another's company. So when it turned out that Philby was all along a Soviet agent, Angleton kind of went a little bit off the deep end and became absolutely obsessed with Soviet penetration of the CIA. But he never really got anywhere. He never found any moles. So it was just he was kept hunting for these moles, and so on. He never found them. And of course, the Aldrich Ames case was then seen as a vindication of Angleton. That, well, he was right. Basically the CIA had been penetrated. Um, I it's hard to believe that the CIA wasn't. And so that that the one people I were primarily working for the Soviet Union, but you know but in this case, who the people who had penetrated it were, I think motivated largely by money, and it's understandable because the people, the sort of the Burgess, McLean, Philby types, they still had the some of the I carried with them some of the idealism of 1917, the 1930s, and so on, and say, well, hey, Soviet Union, they're kind of creating a new civilization. For a later generation, it really wasn't. They couldn't really believe that the Soviet Union was in any way a higher civilization. But on the other hand, they might think, well, this is the only way we can get at the United States is by strengthening the Soviet Union. That's a possibility. You could try to do that. Well, hey, how do we stop America? We help the Soviet Union. Um, I'm not sure that was the case with Ames. I think it was much more to do with money, and so therefore, and it kind of understandable. I mean, if you get it, if somebody if you're living beyond your means, then that's one way of getting some easy money. So I think that was the case with him. I didn't find him a particularly interesting figure. Unlike the Cambridge spies, or at least were interesting, but I didn't find Ames particularly interesting. Anyway, thank you, Robert. And then George Stone River. It's again thank you. It says George, you often read out incoming comments at the start of a live stream. I'm wondering whether they where they're coming from. They don't seem to be on locals. No, that's true. I do that. You're right. I do that at the beginning of um, the live stream. Um, why I do it. I think I do it just to get things off the ground. I mean, it's more and more I do it right at the beginning just to get things off the ground. Some people I see a comment and then I address it. But you're absolutely right. They're often not from locals. They're either from YouTube or they've joined from X. But I just do it more or less to to get things a little bit moving, so to make it a little smoother. So it's just more of a way of moving the live stream along, rather than anything else. But and that's why I don't do it later on, because ultimately, um, I want to encourage people to join our locals community, and I want it's the locals people that I'm primarily interested in, not random, random listeners. I mean, I'm always happy to have them, but locals people come first. So that I think I just do it right at the beginning, just to get things off the ground. No other reason than that. But anyway, thank you for asking. Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Now, as I always say, Cynthia's our resident film scholar and film encyclopedist and film commentator, and who essentially keeps our movie nights, our Monday movie nights, on a very high level, culturally sophisticated level, something that's unique. I mean, you don't get it anywhere else on any locals board or in any board. So it's essentially, we show great films, and then we have this amazing commentary provided by Cynthia. And as I say, I don't think no one else does it. So we're really very grateful for Cynthia. But Cynthia last time asked me about, because of we had the screening of Nicholas and Alexandra, and there was a scene there where we had these guardsmen, these Ethiopian guardsmen, and then Cynthia asked, "Well, what's so they were essentially guards for Nicholas." And Cynthia asked, "Well, what's the connection with the Ethiopians?" And I gave a kind of a tentative answer that I think that Russia had a connection with Ethiopia because Ethiopia was a Christian country, and Russia had, throughout the 19th century, had seen itself as, well, but even earlier, but especially during the 19th century, as the protector of the Christians in the Balkans from the Turks, but of course a Christian a protector of the Christians in the Middle East. So in the Levant, but even further on, and I think that I said that that's probably the link with Ethiopia. But I did look it up, and that was in fact, yeah, I found that that was the explanation, that was the basis of the link with Ethiopia. But something I was a little surprised about, they said that the story that the Ethiopians provided some kind of a god for Nicholas, they said was just rather exaggerated. That there's no basis, in fact, that they comprised a kind of a personal god for Nicholas. So they may have it may have been a part of pageantry, that you'd have Ethiopians in court, and then other monarchs also had kind of exotic people as part of its pageantry. So you would have African pages in with British monarchs. You had from you'd have some people from Asia also with the British monarchs. So therefore the Ethiopians would have been part of the pageantry in order to show monarchs as universal. They don't just have a narrow focus. They're actually kind of have real. They command universal respect. So there they are. You have you know African pages. You got Indians and everything else. It's all part of the court. And so that was the explanation it came up with. So the Ethiopians did not comprise some kind of a special guard protecting Nicholas. Sorry, maybe that isn't true, but that's what I found out. But basically there was a bond with Ethiopia because of the Christianity. Anyway, so Cynthia says here that U.S. foreign policy resembles a mean girls hierarchy, with Trump as the global queen bee, where power is less about war than status, alliances, and indirect aggression. Okay, less about war, status, alliances, exclusion, disinformation, and public shaming. Clout and narrative control replace strategy. Social media becomes the burn book, and authority rests on fear and co-option as much as on force. Putin doesn't seem eager to take the crown so much as to cut it down, exposing a foreign policy built on performance and fragile when challenged. Well, has Putin challenged the sway of the United States? I haven't seen it. You see, the problem um, for Russia, there's no real symmetry here. Yet, basically, the United States gets to do whatever he wants to do in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, that's been accepted. Since the Soviet times. That's it. No one messes with the right of the United States to do whatever it wants to do in its hemisphere. Okay, none of that is extended towards Russia. Russia does not get to do whatever it wants to do in its own near abroad. So the West, the West is always basically run by the United States, but it delegates to its subordinates in NATO and the EU, but it gets to move into Georgia. I mean, how they failed so far in Georgia with there's this new government who prevailed in the election, but they haven't given up, and that's what you always have to remember. The United States and NATO, they don't give up. So they've had a setback. They weren't able to topple this new government in Georgia, but they're gonna keep doing it, and they're gonna keep trying and trying and trying to push out this government in Georgia. Now, the United States is also try to move in with Belarus. It's a very active diplomacy. What Trump is trying to do with Belarus, trying to get Lukashenko away from Putin. I don't think that's going to work. But on the other hand, Lukashenko is not going to be there forever. I mean, he's already getting on in years. Somebody's going to take over from him. And the Americans are already positioning themselves to take Belarus away from Russia. I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm not saying, oh, well, I said that they're going to succeed in prizing Russia and Belarus apart. But this is a long-term project. So while no one messes with the United States in its hemisphere, the United States and in its European subordinates absolutely do mess with Russia in its sphere of influence. And this is really where the problems arise for Russia, which is that it's not able to assert itself. It's not able to push out the West and say, this is ours, and we're not going to have you messing with us. This is our fundamental, vital, strategic security interest. It always has been, and we're not going to have you threatening us. I mean, that's what the Russian leaders say rhetorically, but they haven't been able to make this a reality. So it just becomes a lot of hot air. And so the other thing is from why what Trump is doing has so far been quite successful and has not been successful for Russia is that he's prized away from Russia key allies, which is Syria. Of course, that happened before Trump came to office, but we're just talking about the United States. Syria's gone. This is a long-standing ally of, first of all, the Soviet Union and of Russia. Gone. That's it. It's now basically aligned with the United States, aligned with Israel. Israel. I mean, Russia kind of cultivates good relations with Israel, but Israel is in the Western Bloc. Israel is with the United States. They can have some relations with Russia because there are so many Israelis have connections with Russia. They originally were from Russia, and they speak Russian at home, and they may have all sorts of family ties still to Russia. But fundamentally, Israel is always going to be in the U.S. corner. It's not going to be with Russia. So that's gone, and now Maduro's gone. Maduro was a part of the Russian system of alliances. He's gone. And as I was saying earlier, Trump is now making it move Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. This is a big move by the United States to essentially take over all of Russia's near abroad, all of Russia's formerly sphere of influence and so on. So so therefore I don't quite see where exactly Russia gets its it's how it pushes back. I mean, I one way you push back is, of course, if you achieve a decisive victory in Ukraine, but that seems a long way off, and then it also raises question: what would be a decisive victory? But I think fundamentally, yeah, that you can see all that. The mean girls and whatever. Trump now is full of himself and so on, but pride does go before a fall, and things don't always go your way, and we know about hubris and so on. But at the moment, you'd have to say that he pulled that off with Venezuela. He pulled off the thing with Iran as well. No one thought that they could do it. He did it. where he goes with that, I'm not at all sure. But he did pull it off with minimal resistance against him, and so you could see why he would conclude there's nothing really stopping us. He says there's nothing that we can do, and hence he's now making his move on Greenland. So yeah, I think I'd like that. I'll have that. Yes, that'll do nicely. And I'm not sure anyone's going to be able to do much to stop him. Again, a lot of bluster from the Europeans, just like we get a lot of bluster from Moscow. But I don't see anyone doing anything to stop him. Um, that's how I see it. Anyway, Cynthia then goes on and says Larry Johnson questions why the U.S. chose January the 3rd for the operation to condemn Maduro, noting it's unusual to launch a raid under a bright full moon instead of deeper darkness. Okay. When night vision gives an advantage. Yeah? He argues the timing doesn't fit typical special operations logic, where surprise and darkness matter. And since there was no urgent life or death pressure, the date choice seems odd. Well, yes. I don't know the answer why they did it. I mean, but obviously, Venezuela was thoroughly penetrated. We don't know exactly who was bribed, but many people were bribed. Many people took American largesse and betrayed Maduro. Nothing unusual about that. I mean, we saw the same thing with Serbia with the overthrow of Milosevic. Milosevic's closest aides sold him out, and that's it. I mean, it's you don't have to spend a lot of money. I've said this before. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get people to betray their leader, because we think, hey, great, we'll get him out. We'll stay in power, and what do we care about Maduro? Let him take care of himself. So I think they weren't really that worried about whether it was a full moon or light or whatever. They knew that there would be minimal resistance. The only resistance that came was from Maduro's personal guard, and these were the Cubans. And the Cubans were made of sterner stuff. They came out of a much stronger political culture, which was generated by the Castros, and so they stuck by Maduro to the bitter end. And whatever casualties there were, seems like most of it was the Cubans, but obviously some Venezuelans were killed. I mean, it's looking like about 100 Venezuelans were killed, and something like 32 Cubans. So that I think that was Maduro's personal guard who were killed. The one thing that I'm not sure about, and nobody's asking about that, which surprises me a little bit, which is the claim is that the United States sustained no casualties at all. A couple of people got some minor injuries and so on. I find that hard to believe. I mean, obviously there was an intense shootout. I mean, if you get, if about 100 people were killed, hard to believe that there weren't Americans also killed. I mean, it's just if you got a shootout, there's a shootout. They're going to be killed. People are going to be killed on both sides. So I kind of wonder whether the United States government is lying about the fact that no Americans were killed, because of course, if you admitted that Americans were killed, then that would be very problematic for Trump. I mean, Trump this hasn't been exactly popular in the United States. The polls show nobody likes this, but he can get away with it if there are no casualties. If there were casualties, Trump would then really have to justify himself and say, "Hey, what's the justification for Americans getting killed?" And so that's why there's always this. Oh yeah, no Americans were killed. No Americans, because ultimately, of course, there was no justification for this. America gets nothing out of this. But as long as you can say, okay, well, hey, we're not losing any money, and we haven't lost any lives, so what do you care about some dead people in Venezuela? That's the argument. But if the Americans were killed, then I think Trump would be in some trouble, because then he would have to justify and explain why it was so important to kidnap Maduro. Anyway, then Cynthia goes on and says, however, Anya Parampil notes that Maduro was kidnapped on the anniversary of Soleimani's assassination. Yeah, I thought that. And given Trump's taste for symbolism, the date was likely chosen to echo this earlier show of force. With him, timing is never accidental. Political murder is his preferred instrument, especially when it serves his Zionist handlers. The same motive drove the attempted attack on Putin, I believe, and points to his role in the death of Jeffrey Epstein, perhaps even Charlie Kirk. Well, I don't know. The he it's possible about the Soleimani thing, but why if that's the case, if the date is has a symbolism because of Soleimani, why didn't he do the Soleimani thing on Maduro? Why not just kill him? Why not just assassinate him? I mean, bringing him to trial in the United States, that's going to give him headaches. This is going to go on for a long time. He's going to have all these courts, these liberal judges, this 92-year-old, where nobody seems to retire ever. I mean, if this trial goes on, and this is going to go on for some years, this isn't going to be an easy thing. There's going to be all the legal maneuvering. There's going to be motions to dismiss. There're going to be all kinds of issues about what defenses you can present and so on. The pre-trial maneuverings are going to go on for years. So that long after Trump is gone, there's going to be these maneuverings. So then you have to ask, well, what does Trump care about that? Why would he want this thing to drag on for years, as the Noriega case will drag on for years? Because even if Maduro is convicted, then will immediately be appealed. The appeal is going to go on for years. It will almost certainly end up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and almost all of Maduro's defenses will end up in the Supreme Court. I mean, he's going to insist on his sovereign immunity. Well, and that's going to go up to the Supreme Court. They're going to have to rule on that. He's going to insist on the illegality of his being brought to the United States. He's going to say, you bring me here without allowing me to challenge the extradition, and you're bringing me here where the U.S. law doesn't apply to me. So there's going to be all sorts of things that he's going to say, and Trump will be long gone. I don't even know whether Trump's going to even be alive. I mean, he's not a particularly young man. This could drag on. With Trump already out of office, and Trump may be even dying, and it's still this case will not be resolved. So it's hard to see what Trump gains from this. So if there's a symbolism of the date of the Soleimani assassination, then you think, well, why not assassinate Maduro? I mean, people say, "Oh, well, we don't like, it's not nice to assassinate," but nobody cares. You assassinate, and then that's it. Nobody cared very much. I mean, they did in Iran, but in the United States, no one really cared very much when he assassinated Soleimani. So I don't think anyone would care that much if he did that with Maduro. I don't get what he gains from empowering liberal lawyers, which is what this will be. This is just empowering liberal lawyers, a constant wrangling in the courts between one set of liberal lawyers and another set. So that doesn't I don't see the benefits of it. So if it is a matter of the anniversary of the Soleimani assassination, then why not do the Soleimani thing? So that's that would be the Putin thing is we were discussing it earlier. That's a very that's a problematic thing because I think they're going to keep doing that. I think they're going to keep trying to assassinate Putin, and then that could end very badly. But I can see that would be very appealing. Um, I was thinking about would they try to abduct Putin or try to abduct Khamenei in from Tehran. The problem with pulling a thing like that off, leave aside the difficulty of such an operation, is well, where do you take Putin? You could say, oh well, there's an arrest warrant out by the ICC, but the United States doesn't recognize the ICC, so it would be very peculiar for the United States to arrange a kidnapping of Putin and then delivering him to the ICC that the United States does not recognize. So, and this, with if they were to do that with Khamenei, where would they take him? So, I mean, but I can see that they might decide that they were just going to assassinate Khamenei. Um, but so, but I don't see any courtroom taking him for trials, and certainly Trump wouldn't want to give any kind of credence to the ICC. So he hates the ICC. So that's that. But so that's why I think assassinations. I think in both cases, in the Iran's leaders or Russian leaders, are much more likely. And particularly now with these telephone calls, if I were Putin, I would be very reluctant in speaking to Trump on the phone. You talk on the phone, they're going to be immediately trying to locate, your place of residence. So no more phone conversations. I think with Trump. If that's what I would advise Putin. Anyway, Robert then. Thank you so much, Robert, and says that the striking thing about the crew of the Marinara is its composition. Many Ukrainians, quite a few Georgians, and several Russians, including the captain. The lesson seems clear. The market, the real engine of civilization, routinely brings disparate people together in pursuit of productive enterprise. Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. Political authority, by contrast, too often exists to divide, inflame, and make trouble when none need exist. Well, I think that yes, you're right. I mean, there is always the aspect of making money, but but the interesting thing is that why is it that the theory, which will obviously were very fashionable in the sort of late 19th century and early 20th century, which is, well, everybody's engaging money, everybody's engaged in commerce, countries are trading with one another. It was almost, the world was becoming a kind of the embodiment of Adam Smith's vision. One country specializes in this, another country specializes in that. Free movement of capital and whatever, and that didn't really work out. That dream that countries were putting aside all their conflicts and rivalries and focusing on making money. That didn't really work out. I think, to be honest, that it just isn't enough. I mean, I don't think it's just simply making money is enough to satisfy humans. I think humans have all sorts of other concerns, and those concerns bring them into conflicts with others. Concerns about their tribe, their nation, concerns over uh, you know their the which the Rousseau and Hegel talked about, which is recognition from the other, and that therefore, if they don't get that, and often people don't get that, then that leads to resentment. That leads to serious hostilities, serious conflict, and that human impulse of recognition, or the quest for recognition from the other, surpasses everything else. So, given the fundamental loyalties to tribe, to nation, given also religious beliefs, and then above all recognition from the other, I think those count for more than making money, and that's why that dream, the Adam Smith dream, that everybody's just going to be engaged in peaceful commerce, it's never come about. But there were all sorts of thinkers who argued that yeah, this is, once you embark on this of the trading among nations, nobody's going to want to go to war because they're going to lose money. But that just isn't the case. Um, and and even whatever money you lose, you can make it up quite quickly once the war is over. I mean, you've had that in Europe after 1945. The amazing thing was how quickly Europe recovered from that war. It was a devastating war, but it recovered. Germany recovered in no time at all. So that's why I don't think the money thing is sufficient. It's sufficient to explain human behavior. Anyway, thank you so much. That's a very very interesting point, Robert. And what happened here? That's just I lost the. All right, I'm going to have to refresh the page. Was it? Can I? Okay, so I'm going to refresh the page, which means that I'm going to disappear for about 10 seconds, and then I will reappear. Okay, I'm back. All right, so and yeah, all right, so now I can see the points. Let's see. Um, yeah. I go all the way back. Okay. Um, okay. Okay. Now we got. That's just absurd. Thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity. It says, putting aside your overall view on whether a genocide did occur in Palestine, how long do you see ICJ on the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel taking? I note it's been extended several times, but expect that it's just par for the course. Yeah, it is par for the course. I think it's going to go on for a very long time. These cases at the ICJ um, go on forever. I mean, there's no easy resolution. So I would think, um, in terms of a time frame, I think at least 10 years. I mean, I'm just thinking about the Bosnia case. The Bosnia brought that genocide case against Serbia, and the ruling, I think, came down in 2007. Now, Bosnia first brought the case against Serbia really in the early 90s. I mean, it wasn't long before even the war came to an end. So it was around, I think, 1993. So basically, that took 14 years before the ICJ made its ruling. Croatia also, not exactly sure when the Croatia versus Serbia case ended, but that also, took a long time. So I think you have to think within that sort of frame, 10 to 12 years. Um, and all sorts of preliminary findings and so on. So I I wouldn't expect anything much to come. But I also don't think that when they finally make their ruling, anyone's going to be very happy with it. Um, it's always unsatisfying. Whatever they rule, is both sides are going to be very unhappy with it, and I think that's exactly what happened in the Bosnia Serbia case. That neither side was very happy with that ruling. So that's really the problem. I mean, people got very excited when South Africa filed that the genocide case, as if somehow the ICJ was going to issue a ruling, and a devastating ruling in the near future, and a ruling that somehow people will find satisfactory. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's just not what the ICJ does. So yeah, I'd say, yeah, 12 years at least, and a ruling that will please no one. Is what I would say. Anyway, thank you so much for your generosity. Um, Meg 21093, you said, I was going to say Hungarians are obviously not litigious enough. Yeah, no, they're definitely they're definitely not that. You see these things. There's a very nice whiskey bar here in Budapest. Kind of pricey, but they have a lot of whiskeys there. Now, one of the features of the bar is that the whiskey bottles are really very, very high up, really right up. It's a bar, very, very high ceilings, and the shelves which on which the whiskey bottles are to be found are very high. So you constantly see the young men who work there. They put a chair on top of a bar, and then they get on top of a chair, or they put a little stairs on the bar, and then climb up there to get the bottle. And you think, that is nuts. Anyone can fall off, and if they fall off, they probably bring down the whole shelf with them and fall right on top of the people who are sitting at the bar. So that's bottles, glass flying, and into people's faces, and not to mention everything just falling on top of the people sitting at the bar. I think this is so dangerous. It's so unlike anything that would be tolerated in the United States. Um, and but people just don't notice, and I haven't been there in a while, and this is a fancy bar, as I say, very expensive, but they just pay no attention to a possible accident, and therefore possible serious lawsuits that they might have to experience. Then Steve says import Somalis, and you get Somalia, and then at the end of the day, it is stealing money from people with autism, etc. Pretty revolting. Yeah, that was all of that was the case. Um, but what is extraordinary, why Waltz is just such an absolute disgrace, is that they were able to get away with it for such a long time. I mean, how on earth can you run childcare centers in which there are no children, and no one from the government comes to inspect? No one comes to say, hey, what's happened to the children? Do you really have all these children here? And making sure above all that the children are not being abused. And if, we're supposed to be very concerned about child abuse, and yet they're just doling out millions to these fake charities, and no one does any checking. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Anyway, Steve Kane then goes on. Jacob Frey, worshipped a black drug addict. That's George Floyd, who died from an overdose. Yep. And once during a home break-in, threatened a pregnant woman with a gun. Yep. And it was not a killing. Floyd died with a 3 times lethal dose of fentanyl, along with a mix of amphetamines. A police officer followed the police manual and was not kneeling uh, on the neck, but shoulder. All absolutely correct. And not only that, the police officer was following. Oh, I think, yeah, you said that exactly, the manual. But what happened at the trial was that the head of the Minneapolis Police Department had claimed that this wasn't part of the police procedure. He lied. I mean, he absolutely lied in court, um, to suggest that Chauvin was somehow just doing things, off his own bat, and was not following accepted police procedure as stipulated within the police manual. So that the trial itself was a joke, because it was made clear to to the court that you better find Chauvin guilty, because if he's not, we're going to burn the place down. We're going to burn Minneapolis down unless you find Chauvin guilty. So Chauvin wasn't going to get any kind of a trial. And so you're absolutely right. He had this 3 times the lethal dose of fentanyl, along with a mix of amphetamines. And in fact, I think the original autopsy, is found, there were no real injuries to his throat and neck. No injuries to basically to his chest. And say, yeah, he died of a drug overdose. So then they had to change the autopsy finding to make it seem as if somehow he died of asphyxiation. So anyway, Steve Kane. Now, sorry, I thought you were talking about Fry with a comment on killing. Well, Fry, Fry was talking about that this was murder. He said he called it murder. So to use this kind of language, he talked about that in both cases. He wept over the death of Floyd, but here he was again talking about this woman, and before any kind of an investigation had taken place, he already called it murder. Well, I mean, this is the worst kind of incendiary talk from a public official. He's the mayor. The mayor has to act responsibly and say, well, let's wait for an inquiry, rather than get people worked up by saying that she was murdered. And then Meg says Kamala can give Waltz a job when she wins the presidency. Yeah, right. I don't see, frankly. I mean, I know she thinks she's going to run, and she probably will run, but I don't think she's going to get the nomination. Yeah, that's but I found just amazing that Waltz actually had the insolence to believe for some time that he had that he can run for re-election after this complete horror show in Minnesota, until he started to realize that this is the scale of the corruption and the scale of the theft was just so shocking that, well, maybe they're not going to vote for me. But you'd have to say the Democrat voters are really, really. I don't know whether they're dumb or whether they're despicable or whatever, but how can anyone re-elect Jacob Fry? I don't understand. I mean, the guy was just, he let his own city burn. He let his city burn in 2020. He abandoned the precinct. So he evacuated a precinct. I mean, how could you have somebody like that as a mayor? And yeah, I don't. You think that the Democrats are just mindless, completely mindless in they vote for someone like him, and I guess that's probably why Waltz thought that he had a shot at winning. Anyway, Robert says, in my view, the state's armed enforcement caste does not primarily safeguard individual rights. Rather, it exists to demonstrate the state's brutal peremptory power. Okay. By contrast, private security functions to protect specific persons and property, to deter harm, and when necessary, to resolve disputes peacefully, because its legitimacy depends on consent, performance, and accountability rather than coercive monopoly. Well, the thing, I mean, ultimately, you do have to have. I think you have to have a state that does protect individuals, obviously, from violent assault. They also have to protect individuals from being swindled, stolen from. So you have to do that. Now, I mean, I think that in theory that is the responsibility of the state. I can't, I don't believe that you can have a stateless society. If you had a stateless society, then fundamentally the only people who would be protected would be the rich, who would exactly do as you suggest, which is to have their own private security. And so they'll be all right. They'll have their private security. They'll get their way, but others will not, and they will then be at the mercy of others. As Hobbes described it. Life would be solitary, brutish, nasty, and short. I do believe that. The problem I think arises is how the state does enforce its power, and it does it, I think, in a very selective way, in very politically opportunistic ways. Which is why it's so unsatisfactory. So, if, for instance, if you look at what happened in Minnesota, and let's say the case of Chauvin. I mean, everybody knows that Chauvin was railroaded. I mean, it's fine. Like Robert Barnes, I think, points out, all the things in Chauvin's past, his fitness reports and everything else, and all of that is true. It doesn't seem like, to say the least, he was a good cop. So there was plenty that was negative in his record. Nonetheless, he was railroaded. What was done to him was unfair. On that day, he acted in a way that was responsible. He could have tasered. He could have tasered Floyd. Remember the other police. He arrived late on the scene. The other cops, the arresting cops, just couldn't cope with him. Floyd was a huge guy. I mean, whatever, 6'5", 230 pounds, or whatever. He was just too big for these cops to handle. So he arrived late on the scene. They could have tasered him, which have solved their problem. They didn't. They tried to do it in a humane way, and then because of the political operators in Minnesota, like Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, then Fry, and then Waltz, um, they saw that that this would be a political. They would use Floyd for political reasons. They allowed and encouraged the rioting because they thought this would weaken Trump, and that worked. That did weaken Trump. And then they essentially railroaded Chauvin, irrespective of his own fitness record. But in this case, he was railroaded. and there was this had nothing to do with justice. What happened in that courtroom? So the problem, I think, with the state, I think you need the state, but it's often in the hands of unscrupulous politicians who use the coercive powers of the state for their own political ends. And and so even you had that in the case of what the Biden administration tried to do with Trump. You say, what did any of that have to do with the law, with justice? But that's what in fact happens. When you have opportunists, then they start inventing laws, inventing theories of the case in order to go after their political opponents. So I think that it's the issue is really the how um, the state uses its power, and that when the state is in the hands of basically not disinterested political figures, disinterested lawyers, very much interested politicians, very much interested lawyers who use the coercive powers of the state to destroy their political enemies. Anyway, thank you, Robert. Robert always kind of asks, fundamental, very fascinating philosophic questions, making us think, on deeper issues. Anyway, Meg, thank you so much. Meg 1093, Meg 21093 says, well, Russia has repeatedly not responded firmly, leading me to believe that Putin is an inveterate appeaser. I get in much trouble for saying it, but so be it. I have to agree with you. I'm sorry, but I absolutely agree with you. So that, whether he's an inveterate appeaser, whether he's just simply not what was that phrase from The Godfather, the wartime consigliere. He's not a wartime president. He lacks what's needed in a wartime president. The kind of the boldness, the ruthlessness, the imagination. He lacks all of those qualities. And I'll be honest. I think that as long as he remains in power, Russia's never going to win this war. And in fact, as long as he remains in power, Russia's position is going to be more and more, I think, imperiled, because I think there are going to be more and more of these kinds of events, seizing ships, assassination attempts, terrorism. I think there's going to be more and more of it. I mean, it's clearly the lack of response from Russia is just emboldened the West, and particularly emboldened Trump. So I think that's just that the way. As long as he's there, and that team, the whole team is there. I mean, that's the amazing thing, that there's been no real change in the team. Gerasimov still, the head of the armed forces. Shoigu, he's head of the National Security Council. Lavrov, he continues to be the foreign minister. Zaharova, she's still the spokesman. It's just amazing how there's been really no changes. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Meg, and Anne Marie. Always so good to see you, Anne Marie. Anne Marie is, of course, our professional musician, a very distinguished musician, who plays in all the finest orchestras in the world, as plays with most distinguished musicians, most distinguished conductors and composers. So always an amazing track record. And whenever we post these musical pieces, she always says, "Yeah, I played this, or I'm about to play it," and so she's always able to give us this insights into her own playing and what's involved in actually playing very interesting, difficult, challenging pieces of music. And so I recently posted, Also sprach Zarathustra by Richard Strauss. And Anne Marie said, "Yeah, I'm going to play him at the end of the month." And then on the basis of her experience of playing it, she's going to provide us with some really fascinating comments about Zarathustra. So I'm really looking forward to that. I would love it if Anne Marie were able to post some videos or audios of some of her own performances. That would be so fantastic for the Gaggle. But I'm always so looking forward to Anne Marie's comments and contributions. It's a great honor for us. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. You know, please let us know about Zarathustra. Um, and Carlos says, "Here's some evidence of how you did something." I'm not quite sure what that's referring to, but there's probably some comments. And then Meg says, "I wish someone would explain to me why Russians support Putin." Well, I guess it's the innate conservatism of Russians. I mean, they have had a terrible kind of one upheaval followed another, at least during the past, let's say from about 1914. So you're talking over the past 100 plus years, say 110 years. They had the horror of World War One, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the Civil War, and then the collectivization and the crash industrialization, the Stalinist terror, and then World War II, and then and then return to the Stalinist terror, and so on. And they just probably and then of course you had the sudden, completely unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union. Just nobody could imagine that such a thing would happen. Sudden collapse, and then you had the awfulness of the Yeltsin years, and you can see why the Russians just don't want any more of these upheavals. And I think that there's a kind of innate conservatism that people say, yeah, I mean, better the devil, I do wonder whether um, somebody's being groomed, somebody that we don't know about, who is being groomed to take over. I don't know, and it's entirely speculative. But on the other hand, when Putin became prime minister, nobody had any idea who he was. He just came out of nowhere, and suddenly Yeltsin appointed him as prime minister, and then within months he became president. So it's possible that something of the sort is being done now, but um, as things stand, I just don't think this is this. It's a perilous time, and you need somebody far more imaginative, adventurous, and I think ruthless to deal with these challenges to Russia. Um, and then Meg says Kirill Dmitriev, the Ukrainian with Kiev, with investments there. Yeah, that's right. And Cynthia says um, Patrick Henningsen argues that Trump's actions on Venezuelan oil amount to a payoff to Zionist billionaire donor Paul Singer. Yeah, no, that's right. Others have said this, that it's all about Paul Singer has to be paid off, and he's now Paul Singer, who was of course anti-Trump back in 2016. He was the one who hired Fusion GPS to do that damage report against Trump, which then morphed into the Steele dossier. But it was Singer who really started the whole thing by hiring Fusion GPS. Hey, dig some dirt up about Trump. But now Singer has become a big Trump supporter, and so I can absolutely believe that played a role in it. But as I say, I mean, you still have to get the money from somehow. I mean, it's like the this the oil money it's just there's an oil glut in the world. There just isn't enough there's no incentive. That's what we talked about earlier. There's no incentive to start extracting uh, oil from the ground, because it's just the prices are so low, and if you start extracting more oil, particularly in Venezuela, which is a little hard, um, the price is whatever price you get by selling the oil just doesn't justify the massive capital investment. So I don't quite know how Singer is going to be paid off. Um, so anyway, and then Cynthia goes on. What began in Trump's first term resembles a criminal heist more than foreign policy, an elite cartel trading money and power through channels the public rarely sees. Ironically, Singer once earlier has been the SEAL dossier. Yeah, but Trump has kind of made his peace with a lot of the people who originally tried to destroy him. Like Zuckerbucks and Bill Gates and all. They're all now welcome in the White House. So you know, Trump has this weakness for rich people. He likes them. If they're rich, he likes them. So Singer, he likes Singer. He likes Gates. Irrespective of their politics, he just likes having rich people around him. Yeah. So, but I don't get how Singer is going to be paid off. I don't think there's any real money to be had in Venezuela. And Summer Petros, thank you very much, Summer Petros. Always good to see you. Hope to meet up in Hungary soon. And he says the Gaggle, the antidote to the Duran. Well, thank you very much. I like to think that that's what we are. So thank you so much, and thank you for your generosity. And as I say, look forward to seeing you in Budapest, where we can speak in Hungarian. So anyway, and it makes a good point. And he will embrace a third term as well. I'm taking a poll on whether we'll see the best dream of Miriam Adelson fulfilled. I really do think that it's going to be a hard problem for him to get the third term. I know Alan Dershowitz thinks that you can get around the 22nd Amendment. I don't get the argument. And it's possible he's going to try and make it, but the thing is that he's not especially popular, so I'm not at all sure that he would win an election. I mean, the thing that he's feeling so pleased about with Venezuela is there's no support in the country for it. And if all of this goes to his head and he does something really risky, well, then his numbers are really, if things go wrong, these numbers are really going to go through the floor. So I have my doubts that he can actually win the third term. And then Aristotle 1, would you agree that the communists won in the West? Our power elite manifest all the most radical liberatory ideologies of Marx and Engels, though without the stuff about redistributing private wealth. It tends to be public money. Our moderns seem to spread around. I suppose Antifa and the Greens are almost communists since they live for the cause rather than money. Well, it's a very interesting question, because I was actually reading something by Paul Craig Roberts today, and he was kind of arguing that about that the communists have won but he was more or less saying that if the principle of communism, which is that money is transferred from the productive part of the population to the unproductive part of the population, then that is indeed what we have in the West. And so you can absolutely see that if you have a productive population, that the people who produce, buy, and sell, they get taxed in order to finance. Well, basically, you can either say the non-working elements of the population. But more important, they finance a parasitic class of, of people, bureaucracy, but also within the kind of NGOs and within the various invented government agencies to address all kinds of invented problems. So you always have to address, issues of discrimination against women, against gays, against transgender. So all of this, you require a bureaucracy to deal with it, and then you have to uh, create a parasitic class of lawyers, and lawyers are fundamentally parasitical. Also, they don't really produce anything. They just thrive on conflicts on which they can make a lot of money. Um, so I think that has happened. But then your point about the the aspect of communism, which was the interesting thing was because we tend to think of communism, well that's about equality, and that somehow oh well there's somehow everybody gets the same and whatever. But of course, communism never really was about that. I mean, the communism never had much interest in any kind of egalitarian redistribution of wealth. I mean, there was no redistribution to the productive elements of society, and the proletariat really didn't get anything very much. So the redistribution that took place under communism was to that parasitical class of the Communist Party, and exactly they didn't do anything productive. I mean, they didn't churn out coal and oil and steel and farm produce and everything else. They just oversaw. They had oversight responsibilities. Um, and I think that in some ways you now do have something like that. You have the parasitical class who don't do anything productive, and they have the supposed oversight responsibilities. Um, so yeah, it definitely has that aspect of it, and of course, because they to justify their existence, you have to justify if you're a parasitical class, and you had this or that agency, or you have this and that um, position within the bureaucracy. You have to justify these things. You're picking up a huge paycheck for doing nothing productive. So you have to justify yourself, and you do it by this ideology of transforming the world into one in which people have no uh, or people have no nationhood, people have no identity. They're part of some globalist project. And so, if you look at, I mean, a good example would be, let's say, the European Union, which is a figment of everyone's imagination. It doesn't really exist. I mean, there is no such thing as Europe. There's no real such thing as a union of European states. What there is a vast bureaucracy that insists that there is such a thing as a European Union, and that they try to enforce this union. And the only way they can do it is by continually um, insisting that there is a crisis, there is somebody who is threatening this wonderful European Union, and that is the other, the alien force that threatens all the wonderful things that we are. And so they've invented an image of an enemy, which is like Russia is the image of an enemy that somehow stands in opposition to what European Union is. Nobody knows what it is, but they just simply kind of insist that we embody all that's good and wonderful in the world, all the wonderful things like non-discrimination and so on. So it does have a kind of the features of communism hasn't yet acquired the repressive features of the communist states. But that's coming. That's coming because there are people who are going to be questioning all of these things. They know, hey, you've got a parasitical class. Hey, creating enemies. This ideology that you embrace, whether it's LGBTQ or or immigrants or whatever, and so you have to start repressing things, and that's and the European Union is well on the way to that kind of repression. So, long story short, you say, yeah, there's a lot that there's similarities, but the Marx and Engels thing, yeah, that's kind of gone. I mean, no one really believes all of that stuff. The the glories of proletarianism, that socialism will replace capitalism, inevitability of revolution, all that whole Marxist-Leninist doctrine, and when then we get to this the society, this perfect society, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. All of that, I think, that has been ditched. Labor theory of value, or all of the ingredients. But in some ways, the system that came out of that, and probably they knew that something like that would emerge. That is with us. So anyway, thank you, Aristotle. A very interesting question. And then Cynthia says, if the U.S. concealed American deaths to preserve support for the Maduro kidnapping, the truth, when it emerges, will shatter that support. There's no upside to hiding it. Exposure will only trigger backlash. That I absolutely agree. But it's a question of whether will they be able to keep it hidden. They probably can. I mean, remember, Iran hit back after the assassination of Soleimani, and remember, they hit back against an American barracks, and the Americans immediately said, "Oh no, completely. No one was hurt. No one suffered any consequences. Empty barracks. It's all over." Then, of course, it turned out that people were seriously hurt. They still said no one was killed. I don't know, but they said, well, of course, people were hurt, and people did suffer brain injury as a result of that attack. So I don't know what the truth of that was. So we'll see what the truth of this is. I find, as I said, I find it surprising and hard to believe that you can kill 100 of their people without suffering a single loss of life on your side. It sounds just completely unbelievable. But you're right. I mean, if indeed this is exposed, then yeah, there will be a loss of support. But there's no question. You suffer casualties, and you haven't done the minimum of justifying what you've done. Like Iraq, at least, he had the justification. He was involved in 9/11, weapons of mass destruction, whatever. But in this case, you got nothing, absolutely nothing to justify this. So that's why I think Trump was so desperate to insist that not a single American lost his life. Anyway, it's getting quite late now. So thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for so many interesting questions and comments. Really, really very thought-provoking. I really enjoy addressing people's questions, because they are so good and so challenging and intriguing. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, of course, for contributing to the dogs tip jar. They're going to be up soon, and I think they're just not going to be in a good mood, and then they soon let me have it. It's always my fault. But thank you, everybody who contributed to that. I'm going to have to reassure the dogs, everything's going great, nothing to worry about. But they often just don't believe me. Anyway, thank you so much. So we'll do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then we'll do the joint live stream with Peter next Monday, and then of course my solo next Tuesday. Hope to see you all then. Thank you very much for today. See you very soon. All the best. Good night. Bye bye.